Let history, for a moment, cheat time. Let it carry us not to the beginning of our story, but to its terrifying heart. Picture a dank casemate in the center of St. Petersburg, where the air hangs thick with the smell of damp stone and human fear. In the dim light of a single torch, the investigators of the Secret Chancellery cast grotesque shadows, agents of a department whose very name could freeze the blood in the veins of even the highest grandees. In one man's hand is an instrument not so much of physical punishment as of ultimate humiliation. The koshka, the cat, a short, four-tailed whip with knots tied at its ends, each strike designed to tear away not just skin, but honor. Before these tormentors stood no hardened criminal, no spy, no traitor to the state. Before them, trembling but unbroken, was a young woman, one of the most noble, educated, and wealthy brides in the entire Russian Empire. Her name was Praskovya Yusupova, and at this very moment, this princess, whose ancestors were considered the equals of czars, was being prepared for a degrading ordeal that would have shattered any man. How, then, did the daughter of one of Peter the Great's closest companions, his confidant and friend, find herself here on the threshold of unthinkable disgrace? To understand, we must return to the very beginning. The house of Yusupov was legendary throughout the empire. Tracing their lineage back to the mighty Nogai Khans, they had served the Russian throne with unwavering loyalty, amassing immense fortunes and wielding enormous influence. Our heroine's father, Grigory Dmitrievich Yusupov, was a man of the new Petrine era, a general-in-chief, a senator, a trusted advisor to the reformer Tsar. He was raising 3 sons and 2 daughters, and their future seemed cloudless, paved with gold and titles. But history, as we know, is a cruel dramatist. It delights in raising its subjects to the very pinnacle, only to watch their fall with a special kind of cynicism. It was the youngest daughter, Praskovya, who was destined for a fate so full of breathtaking ascents and terrifying descents that it reads more like a grim novel than an actual life. Her story is not merely a personal drama. It is a mirror reflecting all the brutality, the treachery, and the secrets of her time. An age of palace coups, where the distance between a monarch's favor and a torture chamber could be measured in a few careless words or a single errant glance. We now venture into the labyrinths of the 18th century to unravel the mystery of Princess Yusupova, a woman whom history itself tried to erase from its pages. To comprehend the full horror of her end, one must first witness the dazzling brilliance of her beginning. Praskovya was born into a unique moment when Russia itself seemed to be living through a turbulent, hopeful youth. This was the age of Peter the Great, a time when centuries-old traditions were cracking at the seams, and in their place, amid the clamor of axes and cannons, a new and unprecedented empire was being forged. The very air was charged with the scent of change, of the fresh paint on European ships, and the gunpowder smoke of victory. It was in this boiling cauldron of opportunity where yesterday's Batman could become a serene highness, and a high-born boyar could fall from grace for refusing to shave his beard, that our heroine grew up. She was a child not of old slumbering Moscow, but of the new ambitious St. Petersburg, a city built on a swamp in defiance of all odds, a symbol of one man's indomitable will. It was this very will that Peter valued in people above all else. And Praskovya's father, Grigory Dmitrievich Yusupov possessed it in abundance. A loyal comrade who had been through fire and water with his sovereign, the elder Yusupov was one of the pillars of the new regime. The Tsar would visit their lavish palace informally, without excessive ceremony. Legend has it that during one such visit, observing the bright and spirited young girl, he smiled, stroked her head, and kissed the crown of her hair, calling her a clever one. In those days, such a monarch's caress was more than a sign of affection. It was a mark of distinction, a visible sign that this young creature, too, was destined for a place in the front ranks of the builders of New Russia. And this was no flattery or exaggeration. Even her own father, in whom the patriarchal Tatar blood still ran strong and for whom sons were the true heirs, could not help but single out Praskovya. He saw in her something more than just an enviable bride. He saw a reflection of himself, his own tenacity, his untamable spirit. The blood of his ancestors, the Khans of the Nogai horde, still spoke within Grigory Dmitrievich, and for his beloved daughter, he had a special, intimate nickname, full of Eastern imagery, Syuida or Saida. He often compared her to a well-crafted nagaika, a Cossack whip, flexible, resilient, whistling in the wind, but impossible to break. She bends, but does not break, he would say with pride, looking at her firm gaze and determined stride. How bitter and prophetic that fatherly comparison would prove to be. Then, in the splendor of Peter's court, it sounded like a compliment to her strength, her ability to adapt to a new world without losing herself. No one could have imagined that fate would begin to test that flexibility to its breaking point, with a monstrous force that her warrior ancestors had never dreamed of. Praskovya's youth was a kaleidoscope of brilliant scenes. Here she is at Peter the Great's famous assemblies, the awkward, noisy, mandatory gatherings designed to teach the Russian nobility European manners. While ponderous boyar wives in their old-fashioned jackets stared in horror at foreign dances and compulsory conversation with men, the young Princess Yusupova, in a fashionable paneered gown, was in her element. Witty, well-read, and fluent in several languages, she was the very embodiment of the new generation. She was surrounded by admirers, for she possessed everything: the nobility of her lineage, a colossal fortune, a sharp mind, and a proud beauty. She did not merely follow the rules, she set them, becoming the center of gravity in any social circle. And her closest friend in this glittering world was none other than the Tsarevna Elizabeth, Peter's own daughter. Their friendship seemed as natural and unshakable as the new order itself. Two young women full of life, two fledglings of Peter's nest. They grew up together, studied the arts and sciences together, dreamed together. They likely shared their most intimate secrets, seated in the silk interiors of the summer palace or dashing through the wide avenues of the new capital in a carriage. This friendship was not just a union of two hearts. It was a symbol of the future. It seemed certain that when Elizabeth ascended the throne, her loyal friend Praskovya Yusupova would become one of the most influential figures in the state. Her entire existence, every step she took, every smile she gave, was suffused with this sense of a preordained, guaranteed happiness. The entire world lay at her feet, and there was not a single cloud on the horizon to portend the coming storm. But the golden age of Petrine Russia proved as fragile as the first ice on the Neva River. History, as if weary from its frantic pace, slowed abruptly and then began to retreat. After the brief reigns of Peter's widow, Catherine I, and his young grandson, Peter II, the empire paused, holding its breath. The direct male line of the Romanov dynasty was broken. Power now lay in the hands of the Supreme Privy Council, a group of grandees, Peter's fledglings, who fancied themselves the arbiters of the nation's destiny. They had no desire to see Peter's intelligent and popular daughter Elizabeth on the throne. They needed a figure who was manageable, predictable, weak, and they believed they had found her in Anna Ioannovna, daughter of Peter the Great's co-ruler, Tsar Ivan V. Within Peter's inner circle, to which the Yusupovs belonged, Ivan V's descendants had always been treated with disdain. They were contemptuously referred to as the Ivanovichi, considered a backward and unenlightened clan, relics of the old pre-Petrine order. They were from another world, a world of Moscow's cloistered terems, not St. Petersburg's open palaces. The council's choice of Anna was no accident. She was the widowed Duchess of Courland, living far from Russia, with neither connections nor influence at home. The perfect candidate for a puppet queen. To secure their position, the grandees drafted the infamous Conditions, a document intended to transform the Russian autocracy into a limited aristocratic monarchy. Among the signatures on this document, this paper collar for imperial power, was that of Grigory Dmitrievich Yusupov. He, like the others, believed he was acting for the good of the state, creating a bulwark against potential despotism. It was their fatal mistake. They had underestimated Anna. This heavy-set, seemingly apathetic woman possessed an iron will, a vengeful nature, and a staggering capacity for deceit. She agreed to everything. Arriving in Moscow for her coronation, she played her part flawlessly. She smiled at her guardians, thanked them, and distributed ranks and awards. At her coronation, Peter's loyal companion and one of the authors of the Conditions, Grigory Yusupov, was promoted to General-in-Chief, the highest military rank. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. The aristocrats celebrated, certain they had seized power for good. But beneath the mask of submission, a plan for brutal revenge was already taking shape in the new Empress's heart. Soon, having secured the support of the guards, she tore the Conditions to shreds before their very eyes and declared herself the absolute autocrat. For the Yusupov family, this was an alarming bellwether. But as long as the head of the clan, the powerful Grigory Dmitrievich, was alive, his authority and connections served as a reliable shield. However, fate struck with inescapable cruelty. In September of that same year, 1730, just months after Anna's coronation, General-in-Chief Yusupov suddenly departed this world. His death was more than a family tragedy. In an instant, the entire system of protection he had built over decades collapsed. His children were left alone, facing a regime that hated everything associated with Peter's name and remembered everyone who had tried to limit its power. And the first target for this cold, calculated vengeance was none other than his beloved daughter. For Praskovya, her father's Shuida, the proud beauty and friend of the disgraced Tsarevna Elizabeth, this was the moment hell began. And then it happened. Immediately after her powerful father's death, while the mourning clothes were still new and the earth on his grave had not yet settled. They came for Praskovya. This was no society call, no official summons to the palace. It was an intrusion from another world, one that had always existed in parallel to the glitter of ballrooms and the rustle of silk, the world of the Secret Chancellery. Its director, Andrei Ivanovich Yusupov, was a master of his craft, one of the most effective and therefore most terrifying men of his era. His name was spoken only in whispers. A summons from Yusupov was, in essence, a one-way ticket. But what, in God's name, could they charge a young princess with, a girl whose life had until now been an open book filled only with pages of balls, gowns, and studies? The mystery surrounding her case is perhaps its most chilling aspect. There were no formal charges, no public trials. Everything took place in silence, deep within the state's machinery of repression, which needed no evidence, only the will of the Empress. Society was left frozen in bewilderment. What could have caused the downfall of one of the most brilliant names in the empire? And in that deafening silence of the official record, as always happens, a whisper was born. Rumors, speculations, and theories began to spread, each more terrifying and plausible than the last. Let us then, like investigators, examine these theories, each of which sheds light on the merciless mechanics of power at that time. The simplest and perhaps most accurate theory lies on the surface of human emotion: personal animosity. Imagine Empress Anna Ioannovna, a woman with a difficult past, riddled with insecurities, who had grown up in a secondary role, overshadowed by Peter the Great's brilliant descendants. For years, she had lived in impoverished Courland, humiliated and forgotten. Now, by a twist of fate, she was the autocrat of all the Russias. But the weight of the past pressed down on her. She was pathologically sensitive to any reminder of her second-rate origins, of the fact that her branch of the Romanovs was considered dim-witted. She craved not just obedience, but adoration, flattery, self-abasement from those who had once looked down on her. Her court quickly devolved into a menagerie where the tone was set by jesters, dwarves, and sycophants, all willing to endure any indignity for a monarch's favor. Now, against this backdrop, imagine Praskovya Yusupova, the very embodiment of the Petrine era. Proud, educated, sharp-tongued, accustomed to being the center of attention, not through flattery, but by right of birth and intellect. She did not know how to grovel and most likely had no desire to learn. It is easy to picture the scene at a court reception: an ill-timed joke, a gaze held too long, a curtsy not low enough, or even worse, a witty retort that the dull but vindictive Empress took as a personal slight. For Anna, who had surrounded herself with fawning Germans led by her all-powerful favorite, Biron, such independence and pride from a member of the hated Petrine nobility was like a red flag to a bull. It was a personal insult, a challenge to her authority, and Anna Ioannovna did not forgive such challenges. The second theory leads us into a world where logic is powerless, the world of superstition, an accusation of witchcraft. To us in the 21st century, this may seem barbaric, but the 18th century was an age of contrasts. The Enlightenment walked hand in hand with primitive prejudice. The belief in curses, the evil eye, and incantations was potent not only among the common people, but also in the highest echelons of society. and an accusation of witchcraft was the perfect political tool. It required no rational proof, struck directly at irrational fears, and allowed for the removal of any undesirable figure by casting them as an agent of cosmic evil. Whispers began to circulate through St. Petersburg, rumors that the novelist Valentin Pikul would later capture in his book Slovo I Delo. It was said that Syuida Praskovya had been seen at dawn, galloping on an unsaddled horse near the palace gates, scattering some suspicious powder. This image of wild primal energy and almost pagan ritual fit perfectly with her exotic origins and nickname, Syuida. Here it was, the blood of the Nogai Khans bursting through the veneer of European polish. To the superstitious mind of the time, this was practically a confession. And considering that Anna Ioannovna was pathologically suspicious and terrified of conspiracies, and her favorite Biron even more so, the witchcraft theory becomes frighteningly plausible. An attempt to place a curse on Biron or the Empress herself was not merely a personal offense, it was high treason, punishable by the most horrific means. Whether it was true or a malicious slander was irrelevant. What mattered was that it could be believed. And Yusupov, a master of interrogation, knew exactly how to build a full-blown case from such a rumor. The third theory is the most politically sound: her friendship with Tsarevna Elizabeth. For the regime of Anna Ioannovna and Biron, Peter the Great's daughter was a ticking time bomb. She was the living banner of the opposition. Beautiful, cheerful, and approachable in the Russian manner, she was adored by the Guards regiments, the primary force that decided the outcome of palace coups. Her very existence was a silent rebuke to the rule of the Germans. Consequently, Elizabeth was kept under constant surveillance, isolated as much as possible, and stripped of all support. Her closest friend, Praskovya Yusupova, thus automatically became a person of intense interest to the Secret Chancellery. In Yusupov's eyes, their friendship was not girlish affection, but a potential conspiracy. Every letter they wrote, every word relayed through servants, was examined under a magnifying glass. In this light, Praskovya's arrest was a multi-layered operation. First, it was a direct blow to Elizabeth, an attempt to deprive her of her last close confidant and break her spirit. Second, it was a grim warning to everyone else who sympathized with the Tsarevna. See what happens to the friends of our enemies? And third, it was an attempt to beat a confession out of Praskovya, to fabricate a case of genuine treason against Elizabeth herself and eliminate the main threat to the throne forever. In this game, Praskovya was not a player, but a pawn, ruthlessly sacrificed in a grand political gambit. Finally, the fourth version, the most cynical and perhaps, for that reason, the most terrible: a family plot. This theory points directly at Praskovya's own brother, Boris Grigorievich. He was a thoroughly pragmatic and flexible man, a true master of survival, who not only weathered the turbulent times, but also built a brilliant career under the new regime. According to this theory, he may have denounced his own sister to seize her share of their father's inheritance. At first glance, this seems illogical. There were other brothers, and the estate would have to be divided anyway. But here, the devil is in the details. It may not have been about money alone, but about control over the entire family fortune and, more importantly, a demonstration of loyalty to the new regime. By sacrificing his unreliable sister, the friend of the disgraced Elizabeth, Boris could prove his allegiance to Anna Ioannovna, thereby saving the entire Yusupov clan from potential ruin. It would have been a monstrous act, but from the cold, calculated perspective of the clan's survival, a strategic one. Betray one to save all. Which of these versions is correct? Most likely, they intertwined like venomous snakes into one monstrous knot. The Empress's personal dislike found fertile ground in rumors of witchcraft. The political necessity of removing Elizabeth's friend was perhaps reinforced by a treacherous slander from a calculating brother. The result was a perfect storm, with a single young woman at its center. The system was not seeking truth. It was seeking a victim, and it had found one. For the machine of state terror, the specific reason was no longer important. The flywheel had been set in motion, and Praskovya Yusupova's name was now carved upon its grinding stone. And so, the sentence was passed, not in a court of law, but unofficially in the quiet offices of the Secret Chancellery. But what was to be done with Princess Yusupova? To execute her, a member of the highest aristocracy, without a formal charge would be too scandalous even for Anna Ioannovna's regime. It could provoke a murmur of dissent among the nobility, appearing as an act of senseless tyranny. A more refined, more Jesuitical punishment was therefore chosen, a slow fading away within monastery walls. They would not take her life physically, they would take her life itself, her freedom, her name, her future, her connection to the world. For a young woman full of energy and ambition, accustomed to the splendor of metropolitan society, this was a punishment perhaps more terrifying than a swift execution. She was exiled to the Tikvin-Vedensky Convent. The order was phrased with chilling clarity. She is not to chatter about the inquiry. This short sentence reveals the entire essence of the affair. The primary goal was not to punish a specific crime, but to enforce silence, eternal silence. Praskovya evidently knew or suspected something that was extremely dangerous to the regime. Perhaps it was details of conversations her father had with other council members about the conditions. Perhaps it was careless words spoken in her presence by her friend Elizabeth, or perhaps she herself had witnessed some intrigue. Her knowledge, even its potential, was a threat, and now that threat had to be buried alive in the stillness of a convent. For the sake of appearances, her status was preserved for the time being. She was not immediately forced to take monastic vows. It was a ruse. The state was giving her an illusory chance, watching to see how she would behave in isolation. Imagine that journey into exile. Just yesterday, she was a princess dashing through the streets of St. Petersburg in a luxurious carriage. Today, she was a nameless prisoner in a simple cart, under the guard of grim-faced soldiers, being carried away from everything that had constituted her world. The Tikvin convent, though an ancient and respected cloister, became her prison. The high stone walls that separated her from the world were not a salvation for the soul, but a symbol of her confinement. Every day was like the last. Monotonous services, meager food, the silent, frightened faces of the nuns. It was a life devoid of color, of sound, of events, of everything that had filled her former existence. It was a gray, viscous, agonizing existence, calculated to break her will and erase her identity. But the exile was not mere isolation. It was a meticulously planned, psychological torture. Praskovya was under constant, unblinking surveillance. Every word she spoke, every sigh, every tear was recorded and reported up the chain of command. The abbess of the convent and several hand-picked nuns were given direct orders to inform, to question, and to provoke. They were to ingratiate themselves with her, feign sympathy, all to coax out what the interrogator Yusupov had failed to extract. It was a game of cat and mouse, where the role of the cats was played by these seemingly humble servants of God. They sent talkative cell attendants to her, initiated conversations about life in the capital, about the latest news, about the imperial family, trying to catch her in a careless word. 5 long years. Just think of that number. 5 years in an atmosphere of total distrust, where any conversation partner could be an informant and any kind word a provocation. This ordeal could break the strongest of men. But it was here that the character her father had so admired revealed itself. The very Nagaika that bends but does not break. Praskovya remained silent. She understood the rules of the game. To all inquiries about the reason for her disgrace and her interrogations in the Secret Chancellery, she responded with either silence or meaningless phrases. She accused no one, complained about no one, and did not betray a single secret, if indeed she had any. She seemed to turn to stone, demonstrating astonishing fortitude. Indirectly, from scraps of her phrases, from the topics she stubbornly refused to discuss, the informers could only guess. Yes, she definitely knew something. Perhaps she was covering for someone else, taking the full force of the blow herself. Yet, in this silent defense, she had one vulnerability, one crack in the armor of her silence. It was her affection for the friend of her youth, Tsarevna Elizabeth Petrovna. In a world where everyone had either betrayed her or feared to defend her, the image of Peter's daughter remained her only beacon of light, a symbol of justice and hope for eventual salvation. And when, in conversations with the nuns, the talk turned to Elizabeth, the cold mask would fall from Praskovya's face. She could not hide her warmth. She spoke of the Tsarevna with sincere love and admiration. She recalled their shared childhood games, spoke of her kindness and cheerful disposition. There was nothing criminal in her words, nothing that could be construed as conspiracy. They were simply fond memories and words of support for a person she considered her friend. But in a system of total suspicion, even love and friendship become a crime. To the ears of an informant, these words sounded like a password, a sign of allegiance to Elizabeth's party. Her warm remarks were immediately recorded and sent directly to St. Petersburg, to the desk of Andrei Yusupov. And there, in the capital, these innocent words took on an entirely different, sinister meaning. Aha! The investigators concluded, so she is not broken. She still hopes for a coup and the accession of her friend. She has not repented. She is an unbending ideological enemy. That was enough. 5 years of fortitude, 5 years of silence, were undone by a few warm words of friendship. The trap had snapped shut. A convoy was dispatched for Praskovya once more. She was being returned to St. Petersburg, into the clutches of the Secret Chancellery. And this time, the conversation would be very different. The illusion of a possible pardon had vanished for good. She had been betrayed. In 1735, the gates of the Tikhvin convent opened once more to the state machine. But this time, it was not to receive a prisoner, but to surrender one. For Praskovya Yusupova, the second circle of hell was beginning, and it promised to be incomparably more terrible than the first. Under heavy guard, no longer as an exiled aristocrat, but as a dangerous state criminal, she was transported back to St. Petersburg. 5 years of monastic quiet were replaced by the clang of weapons and the rough shouts of soldiers. She was returning to the city of her youth, but it was now a foreign, hostile place, and its heart, the Secret Chancellery, was waiting to tear a confession from her at any cost. She was brought directly before the same Andrei Ivanovich Ushakov. But he was not the same interrogator she had met 5 years earlier. During the reign of Anna Ioannovna and the all-powerful Biron, the Secret Chancellery had evolved into a finely tuned conveyor belt of terror. Ushakov and his henchmen had become masters of cruelty, honing their methods to sadistic perfection. Bironovshchina, the era of Biron, is what this dark decade would later be called, a time of pervasive denunciations, espionage, and brutal reprisals against any dissent. And Praskovya had been thrown onto the very grinding wheel of this machine right at its peak. They were not going to play psychological games with her now. Now, they would use instruments that could loosen the tongues of the most resolute. The young woman was subjected to an interrogation with extreme prejudice. What did this mean in the language of the time? It meant physical force. The rack, the knout, red-hot tongs, the arsenal of the torturer was rich and varied. We have no precise records detailing the specific procedures the princess endured. These interrogations were secret. The secrecy itself speaks volumes. If it had been an ordinary political crime, a public trial could have been arranged. But whatever they were trying to extract from Praskovya was a secret so sensitive and dangerous that it had to be learned in the absolute silence of a dungeon, and then buried along with its keeper. What could she have known that would lead them to torture a member of the highest nobility while simultaneously fearing publicity and hesitating to simply eliminate her? This is the central question of her tragedy. But the interrogators encountered the unexpected. They had expected to break a pampered aristocrat whose will had been eroded by 5 years of exile. Instead, they met the same Suida Nagaika her father had named her, a whip that only straightened and hardened under the lash. Accounts survive, suggesting that she answered all accusations with astonishing composure and logic. When the absurd denunciations of the nuns and provocateurs were read to her, she did not descend into hysterics, but calmly and substantively demonstrated their absurdity. She transformed the torture chamber into a courtroom where she, the victim, became the prosecutor. She caught the investigators in contradictions, ridiculed their stupidity, and asserted the superiority of her own mind and education. Andrei Ushakov himself reported on the progress of the case to the Empress after each session. One can imagine these reports. The head of the secret police, accustomed to seeing people lose their will at the mere sight of him, was forced to admit that a young woman would not break. More than that, she was defiant. At some point, pushed to her limit, Praskovya went on the counterattack. She stopped defending herself and began to accuse. Directly to the faces of her tormentors, she hurled words that would have frozen the blood in anyone else's veins. She called the all-powerful Ushakov a thief and a torturer, and his department a den of criminals acting not by law, but on the whims of tyrants. Just imagine the scene. The 18th century, the zenith of autocratic despotism, a fragile young woman in the dungeons of the most feared secret service of her time, not begging for mercy, but challenging the entire system. It was the blood of her proud ancestors speaking through her, and it was the righteousness of a person with nothing left to lose. Here she was, her father's Syuida, in all her tragic and unyielding glory. In the end, Empress Anna Ioannovna, who had long since torn up the conditions and was reveling in her unlimited power, grew tired of this standoff. She had not gotten the confessions she needed. She could not fabricate a case against Elizabeth, but she could not leave such a symbol of defiance alive. A final verdict was issued, the quintessence of the cruelty and hypocrisy of her reign. Princess Praskovya Grigorievna Yusupova was granted her life, but it was a life worse than any, even the most terrible, death. She was sentenced to corporal punishment and forced tonsure as a nun. The punishment was chosen with a special cynicism, a flogging with the koshka. This was not a lethal execution. It was a ritual humiliation, a procedure designed not merely to inflict pain, but to break the spirit, to erase from body and soul every trace of aristocratic dignity. But the tonsure hit a snag that became yet another bureaucratic humiliation. It turned out that in the vicinity of St. Petersburg, the capital of a vast Orthodox empire, there was not a single convent that could immediately provide a full set of monastic robes. A messenger had to be sent to Novgorod. History has preserved a remarkable document for us, an itemized list of the cost of the items for Princess Yusupova's tonsure. The entire habit, meant to replace her silk gowns and jewels, cost the treasury 4 rubles and 81 kopecks. This was the price they put on the farewell to her past, her name, her very identity. For this wretched attire, one of Russia's wealthiest heiresses was forced to trade her fine garments. The tonsure ceremony itself was conducted in secret, in the complete privacy of the Secret Chancellery's prison, not in a church to the sound of a choir, but in a dungeon to the whispers of executioners. They had forced her, Praskovya, into silence. Her new name, Prokla, was meant to erase the old. But while they stripped her of her name and status, they could not take from her the one thing that mattered, her will. They had broken her body, but her spirit remained unconquered. Ahead of her lay the final, longest, and darkest stage of her journey. The path of Sister Prokla now led far away, deep into the snow-covered lands of Siberia. A remote convent in the Tobolsk eparchy was designated as the site of her eternal confinement. The farther from the capital, the more secure. The Tsar's decree was brutally clear. There, in silence and oblivion, she was to live out the rest of her days. To the world, to high society, to her family and friends, Princess Praskovya Yusupova had simply vanished, dissolved, as if she had never been. In her place was a shadow, a nameless nun whose existence was a state secret. The regime had done everything in its power to erase her from history. But once again, they had underestimated their victim. They thought that by breaking her body and forcing her into a nun's habit, they had broken her spirit. They were cruelly mistaken. The journey to Siberia was long and arduous, but it was on this journey that the woman who had been stripped of everything found her voice again. She had absolutely nothing left to lose. The fear that holds most people in check had been burned out of her in the dungeons of the Secret Chancellery. Sister Prokla, as she was now named in official documents, did not recognize the tonsure that had been forced upon her. She did not consider herself a nun, and she was no longer silent. The guards escorting her listened with horror and perhaps with secret admiration to her speeches. She cursed everyone from her chief tormentor Yusupov to the entire clique of Germans who, in her view, had seized power in Russia, and of course, the Empress Anna Ioannovna herself. She called things by their proper names, tearing the masks from those who decided the fate of the empire from their luxurious palaces. This was no longer mere defiance. It was an open, declared war by one person against an entire regime. But the most astonishing thing was something else. Her speeches contained no despair or self-pity. They contained fury and faith. When she addressed God, she prayed aloud so that her jailers could hear, for only two things: for the health of her mother, whom she apparently loved dearly, and for the health of Tsarevna Elizabeth Petrovna. This was unheard of. At the height of the Biranovshchina, to openly pray for the Empress's chief political rival was tantamount to an immediate death sentence. But for Praskovya, this was her final and greatest act of resistance. She had turned her prayer into a political declaration, a manifesto of loyalty to the world that had been destroyed. For her, faith in Elizabeth was faith in the restoration of justice, in the return of the Petrine era, in the belief that her suffering had not been in vain. The last documented report on her life in the remote Siberian convent is dated 1738. It is, of course, another denunciation sent to St. Petersburg. The convent's abbess reported in a panic that the newly arrived nun was sowing discord in the quiet life of the cloister. Sister Prokla flatly refused to wear her monastic habit, despised the new name given to her at the tonsure, and demanded to be addressed by her old title, Princess Praskovya Grigorievna. Not only did she fail to show the humility required by the monastic rule, she unleashed the nuns, actively rebelling and likely inciting others to disobedience. She had turned her cell into a headquarters of resistance and the convent into a battlefield for her own dignity. The authorities' reaction was predictable and merciless. For this insubordination, the unfortunate woman was ordered to be flogged again. And to crush any thought of escape, her legs were locked in heavy iron shackles and a round-the-clock guard was posted. She became a prisoner within a prison, a hard labor convict in a habit she refused to acknowledge, in chains, in a locked cell, under constant watch. This is where all documentary traces of her life end. What happened next, we can only guess. How many more years did she live in those chains, unbroken, furious, proud? We do not know. But we know this. In 1741, as a result of another palace coup carried out by the guards, her friend, her hope, Elizabeth Petrovna, ascended the Russian throne. The era of Biranovshchina was over. From Siberia, from monasteries and exiles, thousands of people who had suffered under the previous regime began to return. The prison doors swung open. Justice, it seemed, had triumphed. Decrees of rehabilitation were issued. The lists of the returned and pardoned included many familiar names, but the name of Praskovya Yusupova was not among them. Why? Had Elizabeth forgotten her in the flurry of state affairs and celebrations? Or perhaps the reports of Praskovya's rebellious behavior in exile never reached the new Empress, lost in the archives of the Secret Chancellery. Or could it be something even more cynical and terrible, that a living witness to certain events and conversations was of no use to the new regime either? Or the simplest and most tragic possibility, that by the time Elizabeth came to power, her unfortunate friend was no longer alive, her tormented body long since laid to rest in an unmarked grave in the convent cemetery. This final mystery was never solved. She was simply not found, or perhaps no one wanted to find her. And so, as a convict in chains, in a prison within a prison, in complete oblivion and solitude, the proud princess lived out her days, or met her end before her time. The beloved daughter of a father who saw in her a flexible yet unbreakable will. The brilliant beauty and wit whose friendship with a future empress seemed to guarantee a glorious future. The girl whom, for her clear, lively mind and extraordinary intelligence, once long ago, in another life full of hope, Peter the Great himself, the creator of the new Russia, had kissed on the crown of her head with a smile. History tried to erase her name, but the memory of her defiance proved stronger,